Hi everyone, welcome to the channel where today we're going to have a look at probably the most requested type of video I get, which is how to deploy in Warhammer 40K. I think the reason this video is so highly requested is number one, because it is maybe the most important type of video you can get in Warhammer 40K, and number two, because we have a bit of a habit in this hobby when somebody says how do I deploy of going, oh, very good question, what you need to do is consider these 60 things and then you'll be fine, which is not necessarily the most helpful type of thing, especially if you're a mid to low experienced player, which is who this video is designed for. So in this video, what I have done, I've broken down deployment into 4 easy stages that you can remember. You can take the logic from this video, apply them to any army, and you'll be fine. You'll have a strategic, you'll have an efficient deployment every single time. Before I get onto the first stage, I'm just going to run you through a little bit of logic behind this video and just deployment generally, which is good to have in the back of your mind. So the first piece of logic that we have is that we want to give our opponent as little information as possible when we can, especially at the start of the deployment phase. So for example, I've got Eradicators in this army. I know they're a key unit. I know they're really great against tanks. So if I deploy them first, my opponent's going to deploy their tanks or monsters away from them. They might deploy efficient guns against that unit. So I don't want to do that ideally. The second thing we're going to be having to think about is, of course, the firing lanes, the terrain that's going to be on the battlefield. We're going to be using the GW recommended terrain for this. There's a link to that in the description. And as you can see, there's a lot of terrain on this battlefield. We've got a lot of ruins, we've got some obscuring. This means that I can't just deploy everything and hope to blast my opponent off the board. There are some key firing lanes in this terrain that I'm going to need to be constantly thinking about when I'm deploying key shooting units especially. It also means that when I'm deploying my melee units, I want to be putting them in places where I know they're going to be able to hide and hopefully springboard into a prime position later on into the game. And then the final piece of logic that has to be said is you need to plan to go second. Always in Warhammer 40K, you don't want to be too aggressive. It's a very common mistake people make when they get into the hobby. The other thing you can see with this terrain is that we can hide a lot of our army, basically the whole army. And this is what GW recommends. It's not always the case, but you can certainly normally hide most of your army on a proper 40K board. And we want to be doing that as much as possible. You want to be putting things out of cover in line of sight at their peril. So the 4 stages of the deployment phase are as follows. We're going to deploy the units that are only ever going to go in one place. We're going to deploy the units that are going to go centrally. We're going to deploy the units that are going to hold the mid board. And then we're going to deploy our units to counter our opponent. So before you actually deploy, you have to declare what's in Deep Strike. I'm going to put the interceptors into Deep Strike here. And so then let's talk about stage 1. Okay, so stage 1, deploy the units that are only ever going to go in one place. So we spoke before about how we want to give our opponent as little information as possible. However, we do have to deploy some units, and there are some units that don't really care about where they go. There are some units that have such long range firepower and they ignore line of sight. Like if I had a whirlwind in this list, if I put that down now, that's absolutely fine. My opponent knows it's going to go in the backfield. Likewise, we've got things like backfield objective holders. There's no point trying to trick our opponent here. Okay, they know we're going to put models onto our backfield objectives. So if they're going to put guns to shoot the models on those objectives, we're not going to be too surprised here. We've got infiltrating units as well. Why do we need to deploy infiltrating units early on? Well, this is an interesting one because what can often happen if your opponent has also got infiltrating units, you want to claim key pieces of terrain with those infiltrating units. So if we have a look at this ruin here, this would be a great staging ground for our opponent to launch some attacks. So I'm going to put my incursors here, which prevents my opponent from deploying here early on. Notice though, I have still kept them hidden so they can't be shot. Other things we can deploy now are things like screens. If our opponent is going to be in our backlines turn 1 and we're going to have to screen them out, again, this isn't vital information we're giving our opponent. They know we're going to have to do this if we want to play the game, so that's absolutely fine to do. It's important to remember when you're screening that your opponent does have to place their models down. What this means is that you don't have to go 9 inches to the back because you've got a bit of leeway there, right? So for example, if your opponent's got a drop pod which can deep strike turn 1 with some units inside, you only need to make sure that you've screened out the space for a drop pod and the units inside, because if they can't place them, they can't deep strike them. So you have more room than you think. So in this video, we're going to assume that our opponent doesn't have too many shenanigans, which are going to force us to screen heavily. However, if I did, one of the main things I'm going to want to do is string out my units here to make sure I'm covering as much ground as possible. And then finally, we have got baiting. So if you are an army with a redeploy, you've got a teleport, you've got pre-game moves, all of this stuff, you can actually bait your opponent here if you'd like to. So you can deploy your units really aggressively, for example, and then redeploy them, but you put that pressure on them and force them to actually maybe deploy where they didn't want to go ultimately. So my incursors are down. I'm also going to put my heavy intercessors down, so I have got something on that backfield objective. I'm not entirely happy that these guys are going to be able to hold the board all game. However, they are going to be hidden quite well because of this central terrain, and I'll probably have a bit of redundancy, which means I'm going to have other units to cover them in case my opponent maybe makes a big play, or whether they get really lucky and blow them off the board. So I'm going to have that in the back of my mind later on, that something may need to take the place of the heavy intercessors. But this is something to always bear in mind. Do not just put one unit on a point. If your opponent has anything in deep strike, for example, turn 2, they could wipe that unit off of that objective and then you've lost it. So you want to have that redundancy, that backup plan. And it's also important to remember that if we're deploying in ruins, to make sure that we're deploying over an inch back from the wall, which is engagement range, which will often force our opponent to go round the ruin in order to get into combat with us. And this can prevent first turn charges and keep things alive for a lot longer. So then we've got stage 2, where we're going to deploy the units that want to go centrally. So the logic here is that a lot of units want to go centrally, and again, this isn't super important information for our opponent. They know we're going to put things towards the middle, so they're going to have some guns and some units, if they're able to charge, ready to charge the center of the board. If you're just deploying on the wings, you've got a mad game plan, I'm not going to lie. One type of unit that's quite happy to deploy centrally are units that move quite fast. So we have a repulsor here. This has a 10-inch movement. I'm quite comfortable that if I deploy it here, that it's going to be able to get into one of these 2 firing lanes pretty easily, and so I know it's going to have some targets. You'll also notice that I've deployed this unit behind the ruin, and the reason for this is because this ruin is obscuring, but if you're in the ruin, the units inside can still be shot if they can be seen. So some units can be inside the ruin if they're small, like infantry, and they'll probably be fine. However, repulsor is very big, and so my opponent will probably be able to see it through windows, etc. This is quite a valuable unit to deploy early, but I wanted to demonstrate the point that if my opponent wants to counter deploy this early on, this unit is fast enough to move into a place that actually it might be able to make some of their heavy shooting a bit redundant. It's also going to bait my opponent, so if that anti-tank comes down, then I can put the Redemptor in a safer place later on. Another type of unit that's happy to deploy centrally are units that are both slow and durable. So for example, if we take these aggressors, if I put them towards the wings, they are going to have a really hard time getting into the game later on. However, I know if I deploy them centrally, they'll be able to get line of sight onto this objective here, putting some good pressure on my opponent, so I'm going to get some good use out of them. I think the important thing to remember with this step is that yes, it would be nice if our opponent deployed their whole army first and then we could deploy. However, we have to deploy something, and so deploying the unit centrally is the best decision we can make in this situation. And just a note here, don't deploy too conservatively when you've got valuable units. I know it's really tempting. So for example, some people put their repulsor all the way back here. It's got a good movement, but it's not that fast. So going in this place is definitely the better of the 2 options. I'm also going to deploy the eliminators in this step. The reason being is because they're very fast, so they can get across the board later on if I need them to with their move, shoot, move. And they also apply some really good pressure. So if I deploy my eliminators here, my opponent might think, oh my god, I've got characters, I don't want them to be shot, and they might be far more conservative with those characters, which is what we want them to do. Now, just a note on this step and something else to think about when going forward, be careful not to move block yourself. We talked about move blocking in the movement video, and it's important not to do it to yourself with things like vehicles and monsters, because units that can't fly cannot move through your own models, so just be careful there. So stage 3, and probably the most important stage of the deployment phase, which is we're going to deploy the units that we need to hold the midboard. So we need to decide what objectives we're going to hold. This is a hold 1, hold 2. What that means is that we need to be threatening the 3 objectives on our side of the board, or our opponent's going to be getting 15 and we're going to be getting 10 every single turn, and that puts us at a disadvantage. So in order to do this, of course, we want tough units to hold those objectives. However, a very common mistake I see in Warhammer 40k is people will think, right, I've got Blade Guard, yeah? Blade Guard are tough, so I'll put them on this objective that's out in the open, and they're really tough, so they'll survive, right? No, they won't. They are tough, but they are not that tough. Whatever you put on this objective is probably going to die turn 1. So what we're actually going to do is put our intercessors here first, and they're going to move onto that objective turn 1. Our opponent is then going to blow them off the board. We will then be able to interact with whatever has shot them off the board, and then when we bring our Blade Guard out, some of our opponent's big guns have now been dealt with, and so our Blade Guard are much more likely to survive later into the game. I'm also going to put my captain with Rights of War here. This is going to mean that all the core units on this side of the board have also got OBSEC, because we don't want our opponent to just be able to steal objectives from us. Even objectives in our side of the board, we want to put OBSEC on ideally, or our opponent can just throw a single OBSEC model onto that point and steal it from us every turn, which is not what we want. And so just a note on characters, remember the number of models required, unless they're monsters or vehicles, to screen a character for Lookout Sir is 3. So don't just put 3 aggressors by a character. I'm going to have to make sure I put other units by this captain to make sure he survives later on. I'm also going to deploy my other characters here just to give some support to those Blade Guard. And I've got a Librarian here to cast some spells as well. If I'm screening the captain, I'll be screening the Librarian too, so they'll both be safe. Which takes us to the final stage of the deployment phase, which is deploy the units that are going to counter our opponents. This is what we were talking about earlier in the game. At this point in the game, our opponent has got a lot of their units down, a lot of their key units down, and so these final important units we're going to put down in a prime space. So ideally, places where their efficient units against them won't be able to target them, or where they're going to be able to get into line of sight or into combat with their desired targets. When we're doing this, it's really important to make sure that we're pre-measuring, so make sure you're thinking about the move and a charge, or the move and advance and charge, if that's what they've got access to, their threat range as it's called. Please do be talking to your opponent, asking them what's the threat range of these units to make sure they can't tag our eradicators, for example. With eradicators, they don't need to be killed, they just need to be tagged and they'll be largely out of action. It's really important to pre-measure. It's probably the thing that really differentiates the top players, is the amount of pre-measuring that they do. It's a really good habit to get into. It has such a great impact on the game. When you're looking to counter your opponent, of course, remember if they've got any redeploys or they've got any pre-game moves, make sure they haven't baited you so you make a mistake. And as well as pre-measuring their threat ranges, make sure you know what your threat ranges are. Our eradicators here get to move as well. So that doesn't mean that their range is just the range of their guns, it's the range of their guns and their movement, or the range of their guns, their movement and their advance if it's an assault weapon. So I'm just going to make a point here, this is the recommended amount of terrain. However, it's not always the case that you have this much terrain. So don't let that get into your head. If you have to put things into line of sight for your opponent, just try to give your opponent as inefficient choices as possible. So deploy units where your opponent hasn't got great targets. So they're going to be putting their anti-infantry guns into my Redemptor, for example, or they'll be putting their rocket launchers into my intercessors. That's how we get efficiency back in a disadvantaged situation. And likewise, if things go the other way and you cannot get a line of sight on any of their units, don't let that get into your head. Deploy things in such a way where you know you're going to be able to have line of sight onto the parts of the board where they are going to have to move to. So our opponent has to threaten this objective unless they want us to have the advantage in the game. And so I'm going to make sure that my Redemptor is able to shoot the units on this objective early into the game. So I've also had to put my Outriders down. So in this situation, for example, I know I'm going to be able to hide them behind this piece of terrain in turn 1 and then springboard them up the board. So later on they can maybe tie up some tanks that are in this piece of terrain, let's say, for example. And that is it for the stages of deployment in Warhammer 40k. I hope this has been really helpful. As I say, this is applicable to every army in the game. Of course, there are SKU lists, there are things like GSC that really change the game. However, I promise you that if you follow this logic, you will have a good deployment every time. Some stages might be bigger for you than others, depending on what's in your army. However, most armies will find that they go through all of the stages here. I hope if you're new to the game, this has been easy to understand. Please do let me know in the comments. That's actually a really big piece of feedback that would be good for me, is did you find this easy to understand? What I've tried to do is break down a lot of the things that top players have taught me over the years and make it digestible so that anybody can understand this. If you do have any questions about this video, please do ask in the comments. Let me know what you thought. If you thought this was useful, I'll try and do other videos like this. Please do like and subscribe as well. It does really help. And again, I hope this was really useful. I know deploying is really intimidating for a lot of people. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you for the next video.